IPM for Fire Blight. All right. If you've seen some of the other videos, you know I'll start off with a general suggestion for all disease management. Always start with the best horticultural practices. And this is using things like high-density plantings. Move away from the tall spindle, the semi-dwarf plantings, and really consider investing in some sort of modern horticulture. You're going to get a lot better color. You're going to get better yield to the acre. Anytime you put out a pesticide, whether it's a fungicide, whether it's a growth regulator, you're going to get better coverage and you're going to get better drying time. And in some cases, drying time is both good for disease control and also making sure that if any chemicals have the potential to injure your crop, they're going to dry up quickly and not have that concentration and slow drying effect and end up causing injury. The other thing that you get better air circulation, better penetration, and air and drying is a great thing, and you'll get better sunlight penetration as compared to this tall spindle semi-dwarf orchard right there. This makes, even as a pathologist, my spraying a dream, and would likely make yours a dream as well, because you have a lot more things to deal with than I do in terms of production practices. So along those lines, it's also incredibly important to manage the water. Diseases love water. Pick the best sites. Maybe if it's going to be in a dip or a low-lying area, just don't plant in that one particular spot. Make sure to tile everything. Do a good job with your drip. Sometimes a little bit of drip irrigation will be better than even making an extra fungicide application, just sort of in terms of getting rid of that water. And then anytime there's something you don't need, get rid of dead plant material. Prune it, weeds, get it out of there. All of that's going to harbor disease and decrease the air circulation, and it will just make infections and insect problems and everything a lot worse the more of it you have. I mentioned before, fire blight is becoming increasingly problematic, and in many instances, here's some fire blight. Right here, a tree is completely devastated by fire blight in about 2 to 3 weeks. And as I mentioned before, the high-density super spindle plantings are incredible for air coverage circulation, but they're also now, our orchards are becoming much more valuable per piece of land. We have a lot more trees on an acre, and they're very, very high value. And in many instances, the way that the super spindle orchards are going to be very vigorous, they're going to be very active, they're going to have a lot of fruiting wood that's fruiting and being removed. And when they're really young, they might have some protracted bloom, which means it'll bloom when it's really, really hot. And there might be a lot of young, vigorous shoot tissue at play. And this fire blight really will go after these. And once it hits those, it'll really collapse that type. If you think this tree might die very quickly in 2 to 3 weeks, a young tree will die even more quickly, particularly if it's actively growing and really, really, really moving, especially in the ears where it's trying to get to that top wire. And that's when we have to be extra careful. You can't really avoid this necessarily with the resistant rootstocks, particularly in these high-density plantings. Once you hit that leader, you need to remove the tree, because at that point, it just becomes a source of inoculum. And unfortunately, nearly everything that's really popular, that stores well, that grows and tastes great, and consumers are excited about it, is highly susceptible to fire blight, which is a fairly sad thing. A couple different phases to fire blight. One is the blossom blight, and one of the worst parts about this is it reduces the current season's crop, which is not good. But it is the one stage where we can actually do a good job of managing it with forecasted antibiotic applications. That's how we defeat that. Shoot blight is the most devastating part, and this reduces the bearing wood. This is the source by which the fire blight will move through all the tissues and eventually kill the tree pretty quickly. And unfortunately, some of the best ways to sort of manage this are pruning, defense activators, and with the growth regulator, peroxidine calcium is another really good source. And then finally, rootstock blight. Now, the resistant rootstocks might not save your orchard if it gets a lot of shoot blight in the scion, but what they can do is really prevent a systemic infection. If the rootstock is out there suckering, or if it's a rootstock variety that has low suckering potential, that just protects you against fire blight infections of the various suckers. And if a sucker gets infected, it could take your entire tree down. While one shoot gets infected up on the scion, you might be able to remove or mitigate it and save the tree pretty quickly. But this is where resistant rootstocks really shine. Avoiding any rootstock blight. You can kind of see here in the picture, an oozing rootstock there. Might have been a rootstocker over there that quickly gets fire blight, goes to the root system, and the whole tree collapses. However, if you saw if you didn't get any infection here, it's not a direct path to death. And so this is where they really work out. The last phase that we manage for fire blight is usually a trauma blight situation, and this results from various wounds caused by hail, wind, various animals, and we have a lot of windy storms. We might have hail right around when the fruit are very small, petal fall, and shortly after. And this will end up destroying a fresh market crop. And if it hasn't completely damaged or run your crop, you can try to manage this with antibiotics, because bacteria that might be present may be splashed around and get inside wounds. But if everything is lost, such as in this picture here with the hail damaged, you will not get this fruit to fresh market. This is a good opportunity to protect these wounds with copper and save the tree. And over here, we'll have a similar, if you've seen the apple scab presentation, this is a very similar cartoon of the fire blight disease cycle and how the various management practices end up influencing it. And so here, what we can take a look at and see is it begins with cankers oozing early on. During spring, when the buds are breaking dormant, the bacteria might start to run. And at this point, as the weather continues to warm, this ooze may end up getting splashed or fed on by insects and transported to the newly opened flowers. And it may be wind, rain, it could be insects, it could be any number of factors. And once it gets on the flower, it'll multiply on that stigmatic surface. And then all it needs is a little bit of water. It needs really warm weather now. And with a little bit of water, it'll wash into that cup. And the next thing you know, the entire blossom is blighted. And from that blighted blossom cluster, the fire blight will move throughout the entire plant system and move to the active growing parts of the shoots. And if it gets too clogged with bacteria, it may ooze out. And then more insects and more wind and rain can pick this ooze up and disperse it around and cause more and more infections. And it may even travel to fruit and ooze on their surface. And it may even get into the deeper parts of the plant, the scaffold and the rootstock, if it's not resistant, and kill the entire plant. And unfortunately, begin the whole process over again. And so one of the first few things you can do early on is just like with the apple scab pathogen. We have those disease progress curves. You can think about fire blight incidents going from 1 to 0. And you can think about yourself getting closer to harvest. And in the early phases, all that fall, summer pruning will take what potentially could ooze next spring and get it out of your orchard. You're taking that inoculum and getting rid of it. And what this does is it pushes your disease curve to start at a much later time. Less inoculum, it takes more time for the bacterium to build up, and it gets you closer to harvest. So if you do that sanitation and pruning, you can think about your disease progress starting much later and going, maybe even ending up with 80% doing nothing. You can think of that as adding in some silver-tipped copper. It just pushes it as well. You can do both and push it to the point where you might even escape infection entirely, because by the time the disease gets ramped up, you've hit terminal bud set and the whole process is over. Later, when you're going after bloom and blossom blight infection, you can begin to think of it as flattening that curve. Now that you've had an infection or something of that nature, or you're preventing the infections, you can kind of think of, okay, I stopped it. I gave it so little inoculum to begin with that by the time it gets to start becoming very exponential, it will be a very short, flat, not very ramping up epidemic. And this is what ends up happening. When you're putting those biologicals and defense inducers and antibiotics at bloom, you might think of taking your curve and flattening it. It may flatten it all the way to the bottom. And later, and particularly when you go in and go after the bacteria inside the plant, and this is where your systemic acquired resistance inducers, the defense inducers, your PGRs, and even in-season sanitation. Anytime you take this shoot out of the equation, or you prevent the bacteria from migrating here and making more ooze, you take the potential for this epidemic to increase at a very rapid rate with insects and wind and rain and other nonsense happening during the season, and you just flatten it so that if you do both together, you won't have a curve that looks like 60%. You'll have one that's 0. Your epidemic will start here and not go any higher than a little tiny blip, if you will, right when it gets by the time you hit terminal bud set and the fire blight doesn't have a chance. And in this case, I show a rather extreme example, but this sort of shows how the two pieces of the puzzle, starting, making sure your inoculum starts late, and when the time it has a chance, it doesn't even have a chance to even go up, and you get no fire blight whatsoever. And that's how those two pieces work together. Finally, you can use less susceptible cultivars. Right now, unlike apple scab, we don't have a lot of single gene resistance in the popular cultivars. And this means there's no like one gene that will shut fire blight down. It's pretty aggressive. However, there are resistant rootstocks, and this is where they come in. And as I mentioned before, this is a really great, and I include the Geneva series. And if you can make it to the second year, the Bud 9 series as well has sort of ontogenic or age-related resistance, meaning by the time it gets to year 2, it won't quickly allow a sucker infection that is shown here and has killed this entire tree very quickly. You know, if you got one infected shoot up here, you might be able to save it. But if you get a rootstocker that gets infected and it goes right into the rootstock, it's sort of over with. However, anytime you get a tree with this much infection, you need to get rid of it. But what can you do postseason? Okay, maybe you still have some fire blight left over, or there's something little that snuck in later, or it comes in June after you finally finish thinning. One thing to do is to make sure to go in and clean up inoculum, and this will reduce spread within a tree, any one of these things that gets removed, and between trees. Just prune out strikes and any small cankers. You can even do it in the dead of winter, and you can even leave the cankers on the ground to dry out. Fire blight can survive winter, but what it can't survive is dry, unliving tissue. And so it's fine if these things are on the ground here, drying out in the snow. And even if the snow melts, the tree, when it's cut off like that, it's not going to regrow again. And if it's not growing, that fire blight is stuck in there. And I can tell you this, that it has become quite apparent that if we have a bunch of old trees that are dead and dried up with fire blight in them, we can't even get a good disease trial going. So they're not going to contribute a lot of inoculum to the orchard. Later in the spring, you can sweep these up. If you can sweep them up and get rid of them earlier on, that's fine. I mean, initially, if you're cutting out in the spring, you might want to keep them on the ground because they might be active for a couple of days, and you don't want a windy storm to kind of disperse them about. Here's our nice oozing canker. This is preseason now. Scout, look around for anything like this. If I saw this much canker on a main limb of an apple tree, I might think to get rid of that tree because this would scare me. I might send that in and ask to make sure it wasn't something else, just like a regular oozing, that it was indeed fire blight. But they can be really large, depressed, cracked areas. You can't really prune that one, or they can be smaller things. And some, fortunately, small blossoms and shoot infections become too numerous to prune out, too hard to see, no one knows they're there, and that's how the fire blight epidemics get started. But what you can do to combat those right off the bat is that delayed dormant fixed copper application. You didn't see all the shoots, you couldn't prune them all out, but you know what? You can coat them with a really fixed copper. Usually pick one of the ones that's a powder type. It'll last a little bit longer if you can't get back in the orchard to spray it again, because the tissues will grow past it and rain might wash it off, but it will take a little more rain if you pick a heavy copper, maybe 15 to 30%. And this can do a lot to get rid of that inoculum. You can think of taking your disease progress curve every time you apply that copper and just pushing it closer to the end when you would hit terminal bud set. Bloom, if you want to go after the bloom phase, and I think everyone should, we have enough fire blight in New York to always mandate a bloom program, because this is where the inoculum is going to start. You've removed as much as possible, but it only takes a couple cells on the stigma. I don't see it in this particular flower picture, but to get in there and multiply in really warm weather, wash into the cup and start that infection. And then from that infection, it moves into the plant, and then it gets all throughout the entire tree, causing a lot of trouble. And if you want to do this, the best thing to do is listen to your consultant, listen to your extension specialist, listen for their alerts. You can run the disease models themselves, but sometimes what's really cool is the consultants will be running them with multiple scenarios, other conditions that are really specialized for your region, and make very specific predictions. However, if you have an on-site weather station and you get a different prediction from your specialist, you probably best should follow that one, because the specific weather information and forecast for your specific block will be more specific than a regional one. But for the most part, if you don't have time to pay attention, follow your consultant, follow your extension alert, and see what they're saying about fire blight pressure that week. And we have a nice newest system for it. And Yeah, and for the most part, you'll see the blue models, and they do overpredict a little bit of risk, but you shouldn't need any more than 3 applications to get to petal fall. And the bottom line is if you do it right, you can't ever tell when it is. I can tell when my orchard's when my one well-timed application will manage the entire population because I have the inoculum in the other hand and the sprayer in the first hand. But one will do it. You really don't need to do a lot of them, particularly with the antibiotics. Some of the defense activators you'll need to apply a couple of times to really boost up their signal, but the ones that kill the bacterium, really one good shot will do it. And always use the model plus common sense plus your consultant. If your model output specific to your orchard is different from common sense or a consultant, or it is common sense and it's different from the consultant or the extension alert, use the one that makes the most sense for your production. If your weather system has gone berserk and is spitting out weird data in the model, well, maybe don't use that one and then follow the consultant's recommendation. Strep resistance is still fairly rare in New York, but there are places that have it, and those farms that have it do know where it is, and it can be squished out. Right now, I still think it's still rare enough in many places that you can start with streptomycin. And as I mentioned before, in many instances, this is still a little bit of your secondary cycle plus that initial inoculum. And all the ooze that arrives first is going to be here, and this is when you can hit it with the most effective material. Right now, it is very effective. If you have resistance, you can either do kasugamycin first off, or there are a couple of other things to try as well. But for the most part, if I had resistance, I would apply kasugamycin first off. If you think you need 2, use 1 strep, and then use a kasugamycin afterwards. And that will help eliminate any resistant escapes that get loose. If you're organic and you have susceptible varieties, you really don't have a lot of options for antibiotics. That has no longer allowed since 2014. There are some good biologicals and some really good products. And what you might want to use in this case is I'll show you the noodle model eventually, and it will put out some values. And if you want to go with biologicals and low copper products, you will use more frequent applications at a much lower threshold, this EIP of 60 to 70 during wet, warm weather, and always use the most local weather data as possible. Now, what can you do for the shoot blight? And this is where, once the bacterium's inside the plant, this is where you would use the things like the defense inducers or systemic acquired resistance inducers and stuff like prohexadione calcium, growth regulators. There are a couple of others as well, and some of the resistance inducers include things like acylbenzolar S-methyl, which is a really nice synthetic resistance inducer. You can use extract of giant knotweeds, and there are some bacillus species that will also induce the defense pathways in apple. And the prohexadione calcium will slow down vigorous shoot growth. And the one thing that happens is we do know this: the more vigorous the tree, the faster the fire blight bacterium will invade and run through the tissues like wildfire. So a very vigorous tree will be more devastated, but you can use prohexadione calcium to slow down the growth in those trees, and is one of the best protectants against shoot blight. And there's a couple of different options you can do. Ones that we've really liked are the standard program of 6 to 12 ounces per acre at petafall, and then about 10 to 14 days later. And usually this is a highly vigorous time, and this is why it works really well. If you're having a really young trees, we found that sometimes you can start at pink, but that's mostly to sort of stop the invasion of infected blossoms, but it does do some good for shoot blight as well. And then there's another option as well where my colleague and I, George Sundin, are doing some studies out of New York and Michigan, where he's sort of leading the charge on using a little bit of prohexadione calcium and a little bit of this acylbenzolar S-methyl. And they both have sort of their own effects on thickening the cell walls and preventing that invasion of the tissue, doing a little bit at pink with both, and a little bit again at petafall, those 2 periods of really vigorous growth. And so those are some really nice times where you can begin to try. And if you have a young planting and you don't want to completely shut them down, these types of approaches, the pink 2 types of approaches, do not seem to have that great of an impact on shoot growth later on when the trees are growing. However, if it gets really, really, really hot and wet, you might want to slow down the shoot growth in order to avoid late season fire blight infections. So what happens at the end of bloom? Okay, what do we recommend now? This is a good time to do copper. Yes, it can cause fruit russet, but if you're in a non-bearing orchard, nursery, or during establishment years, you can use copper. Just apply it with adequate drying time. Hot, wet weather and copper is where the problems will occur. I can routinely use copper for all my experimental trials on Gala, never get any injury, but it's all about good mixes, adequate mixing in your tank volume, good drying time, and not used with a lot of really heavy adjuvants. And it's only a protectant, so it'll only get surface bacteria, in case something is oozing over here. There's copper on this shoot right there, and a rainstorm comes and splashes it. If you have copper there, you'll protect against it. It's not going to get inside the tissues and wipe everything out. And unfortunately, you have to do it every now and then because the terminals can just grow past your copper residue as they continue to get larger. And one of the bigger popular programs is one of these low rate or these sort of safer low MCE coppers, less than 15. And people usually use them at low rates and do them about every 7 to 10 days until they get that terminal bud set and the tree stops growing very much. And once it gets cool, things are better for fire blight, even if trees are growing a little bit. Post-bloom, what do you do? If you see any newly developed strikes, you should try to remove them on a cool day as possible. Cool, dry day. We're doing some more investigations of pruning practices in recent years, but right now the best practices is to cut at least 12 inches into healthy tissue, and if you can, go back into last season's growth. And, if you're cutting this thing there, make sure you're going to cut back into that a good bit because those growth junctions are really harder for the bacteria to cross, even when the tree is moving, and it's a good opportunity to make sure that you don't have any left behind. Unfortunately, if you get to the point where, oh no, what do I do? This whole shoot blight's right there on the scaffold, and now there's a huge canker right there on this particular scaffold. I hate to say it, at this point, you can cut it off, but that tree's not going to ever grow back to anything that would really serve your operation any. It's just going to be a sprinkler for inoculum. You can think of this as, and once it hits that central leader, it's just going to go all over the plant eventually if it keeps growing. And when a rainstorm hits, it's just going to disperse stuff. I mean, my orchard is ridiculously widely planted, but if you were really in a high density super spindle, with 18 to 36 inches apart in trees, you're just going to have a sprinkler system of fire blight. So get rid of that thing right there. Now, if you can rescue it, if all is going to be lost anyway, and you're like, great, everything's got fire blight, do I just rip it all out? Or, you can try to save it. You can save trees with this program. Some research out of Geneva and the Hudson Valley, a rescue program, 6 to 12 ounces per acre. I mean, if everything in the orchard is already a sprinkler for fire blight, why not try to save it? 6 to 12 ounces of apogee per 100 gallons, wait 5 days, and do it again, and then prune every two weeks until terminal bud set. The reason why we say is wait 5 days is let this shut the growth down, because the moment you start pruning, it'll re-stimulate the growth. And so you may even need to do a second rescue program if the trees are very vigorous and very moving. So let's wrap up this session with a little bit on fire blight forecasting. And so how this works is it predicts the blossom blight infection risk. That's how the fire blight gets in. First, it's on the cankers. It's oozing. It's getting splashed around. It's in the air. And where it comes in is on those flowers. And this part will predict the conditions in which flower infection is possible. And so what else can we do with the models? They can do a little bit of helping you track the development of shoot blight, but really not infection, because shoot blight often occurs when deer, rain, and hail occur. And there's no model that really predicts deer, rain, and hail attacking your orchard in those particular instances. You're best off just watching the Weather Channel. And if it's inside the plant, we really have no idea on how to predict its behavior, because the environmental conditions, the things we might monitor, are outside the plant. And so in that case, you can really just sort of track what we know about it. But if you're spraying for blossom blight, disease forecasting is the best practice for avoiding antibiotic resistance. And we have a system in NUA that's free for all growers, and it uses both heat units, which is the most important thing for bacterial growth, and water, which is the second thing that is needed for infections. So we have two different systems in there. We have two models. It's basically a decision aid support system. Try not to think of NUA as a model. Think of it as a weather system that has multiple models in it. And if you don't like one model, there's two. in this particular instance. We have one for out of Washington State that actually works very well for New York conditions, and we have one that was developed at West Virginia and the University of Maryland that also works very well. They're both based on heat. And what they do is they both get integrated with the NOAA and RCC weather data that's coming in from the satellites or the weather station on your farm. If for some reason your weather station explodes or gets knocked over by a a wild deer or something like that, or a tractor, then guess what? It will filter in right from the satellite so that you don't miss a beat. It's completely fully automated with limited user inputs. And what you need to do is to make sure it's got the best and most accurate first blossom open date. A lot of these models will be running in the background based on blossom life, which can vary between cultivars, but it's always best to start off this model putting the first blossom that you've seen in your orchard, that first king bloom, because you never know when the heavy and warm weather is going to come. Let's take a look at it. What we have here is how it might work in a forecasted mode. I've changed my blossom. You can put in a different history. I have Fire Blight right now. That will make the predictions much less worse for this Cougar Blight model. And as I mentioned earlier on, this EIP value, you can think of that as your score for trouble with Fire Blight. The higher the number, the more trouble you'll have. And you can see in this instance here, you're deep into May, and you're thinking, well, I could almost be out of bloom, but I do have some high weather predicted. And this is some general thresholds we might recommend. If you see something with an EIP greater than 70, this might call for streptomycin or kasugamycin. Right now we're at 69. We're on the border. You have to make a tough call, if you will. But at the same time, some of the biologicals would probably work really well with an EIP of 40 to 70, which we often have a lot. But in this instance, it doesn't mean you need to put a biological on every day. Once you've managed that first round, it's going to reduce these numbers to effectively a 0, but they can come right back up if it gets really, really hot. But that's kind of how the model works. It also needs heat and it needs water. And you can see on this date, I do have some water before and after, and an average temperature that's really high, and all the numbers are right. So maybe this is my day for streptomycin. You can see the other days surrounding it are maybe not the right day for streptomycin. It tells you how and when the environmental conditions are favorable for infection. It doesn't really guarantee failure or predict future disease. You can think of it as like your traffic alert or a tornado watch. It tells you when the conditions are bad, or warning when fire blight has been spotted in the area and you need to go take shelter. It doesn't really let you know that fire blight is going to get your crop or ensure that you get it or any other things like that. It doesn't predict control failure or future disease. It just tells you when the conditions are right. It doesn't really do much for shoot blight, but there's a little bit of predicting that it can do. It sort of tells you when shoot blight might have occurred or when you might see symptoms if you had a traumatic event. And the reason is it really just can't predict anything about the movement of bacteria to the growing shoot tips. And there's no way it can really tell you when you're going to get an external injury due to insects, animals, or warm, windy storm, all of which are the factors that initiate shoot blight. However, if you're going to go for blossom blight, it's definitely the most cost-effective way. The effectiveness of your strep spray or any of the sprays you make will be much better when the environment is favorable for the bacterium and it's growing like crazy. And always, if you're going to use antibiotics for blossom blight, make sure to use those models to guide the application timing. That's the best way to do it. You'll get the best control, and you'll also waste the less product, and you have the least risk of resistance selection. With that, we're going to wrap up Fire Blight.